Lesson 9, Life and Death in the Ghetto, 1939 to 1942. Let's review Lesson 8. You'll recall that we were looking at the establishment of the ghettos in Poland. It's worth remembering that Polish towns and cities, most of them had a Jewish quarter in 1939. We'll remember that by 1939, Jews lived in these places mainly because of cultural reasons, linguistic reasons, religious reasons. Shortly after the German invasion, however, the SS drew up plans for the short-term ghettoization of Polish Jews. So this is very different. Jews are going to be forced into parts of large Polish towns and Polish cities. We should also remember that there was little direction from Berlin on how to manage individual ghettos. So those Germans, Nazis, put in charge of the various ghettos were given an awful lot of leeway on how to run their Jewish ghettos. And so thus they were managed on individual lines, and no two ghettos were ever run the same. Now, last lesson we really just looked at two ghettos, otherwise that lesson would become very unwieldy. We looked at Lodz, which was the first city to set up a Jewish ghetto and to seal it, which is to say turning the Jewish ghetto of Lodz into a large prison, ultimately. The Warsaw Ghetto, in contrast, was created in fits and starts, and this really illustrated the ad hoc nature of the ghettos. That's to say, Nazi managers were in essence making it up as they went. The ghettos went from short-term to medium-term solutions for the Jewish problem. Originally, these ghettos were expected to be around for only months, not more than a year, but it became very clear that it was no longer going to be a short-term solution, and the ghettos became more of a medium-term. We're looking at perhaps several years. And as a result of this, some Nazis, and they were challenged on this by other Nazis, some Nazis successfully argued that the Jews should be economically exploited to help Germany and particularly the war effort. So this was this productionist argument against the attritionists who simply wanted to keep the Jews in the ghettos, give them substandard rations, and ultimately slowly starve them in those ghettos. Those Nazis lost out on that argument. And for a time, these productionists won out over the so-called attritionists. But nevertheless, the ghettos would be liquidated, much to the relief to the Nazis who managed them. They did not want to have Jews in their districts. They did not want to have Jews in their Polish cities that they were managing, and they were quite keen to get rid of the Jewish problem as they saw it. The notion of better treatment is very relative. Around 600,000 Polish Jews died in these ghettos in the space of 2 years or so. So, what we're going to look at today, of course, is how was life in the ghettos? And we need some context. We've looked at some of this stuff already. We looked at National Socialist ideology. We spent a lesson on that. And I just give you a quote here. I believe this is a quote from Hitler himself. The personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew. And of course, in Germany itself and also in Poland, Jews had their property stolen by the Nazis. And ultimately, they had their livelihoods stolen as well, be it their businesses, kicked out of their employment. Their lives were destroyed. And of course, they were forced into ghettos, which were virtual prisons. And ultimately, many of them were turned into slave labor. And we'll also remember that the Einsatzgruppen in Poland, we will talk later about the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. But in Poland, we will remember that the target of the Einsatzgruppen were Polish intellectuals. However, thousands of Jews the number seems to be something like 8,000, were killed indiscriminately while the Einsatzgruppen were murdering Polish intellectuals. In a sense, they got in the way. The Einsatzgruppen were SS members. They were recruited into the SS, among other things, for their ideological purity. So these are people who really do hate Jews as well. So you can imagine if the Einsatzgruppen came across Jews while they were murdering Polish intellectuals, well, those Jews are going to die as well. And what's my point? Well, taken together, what would ghetto conditions be except appalling? Everything that we've looked at thus far tells us that Jews were treated horribly. And so what could ghettoization be for Jews except a hell on earth? So I have a few photographs here. This one is from someplace in Germany in 1939, and you can see German soldiers are aboard a train to Poland, and with the sign, or not a sign so much, but graffiti on the train, "We are traveling to Poland to beat the Jews." And you can see on the left-hand side of that graffiti, there's a caricature of a Jewish man with the big long nose and that type of thing. These are Jews being rounded up in Warsaw in September 1939, and you can see that several of them are practicing Jews. Others seem to be perhaps secular Jews, but they're being rounded up. This is a rabbi being paraded around lots in a humiliating fashion with other Jews beside him. You can see the kind of honor guard in a sense, and they're carrying brooms as opposed to guns. Again, it's just another way to humiliate the Jews in lots. And this is an interesting photograph. You've got children working as forced laborers in a factory in the Lodz ghetto, doing something with shoes. So one of the things that perhaps some people forget about because of the carnage, because of the millions murdered, etc., is that there's a cultural destruction in Poland as well. Poland had the largest concentration of European Jews in Europe before World War II. And as I said before, many small towns, most small towns had perhaps a small Jewish community, perhaps a larger one, depending on the town. And these towns were destroyed with ghettoization, and the vast majority of them are gone forever. So with the forced movement of Jews to large towns and cities, the Germans destroyed thousands of small Jewish communities. Most would be lost forever. Before World War II, Poland's Jewish population or Jewish community ran into the several million. And today, the last time I looked, the Jewish population of Poland is something like 10,000. So you can just imagine the amount of culture and history going back hundreds of years was destroyed in these towns and villages. Alexandria, a town of 3,000 Jews, was typical. The town enjoyed the prestige, in the Jewish community anyway, of being the seat of the Alexandria Rebbe. That's where we get the word rabbi from, and a rebbe is a spiritual leader of a particular region. To make a crude parallel, you might think of it as a bishop, perhaps in a Christian country, who's in charge of a bishopric. Well, in any event, on the 8th of September, the Einsatzgruppen burned down all the town's synagogues. And here I have a good quotation from Lucy Davidovich from her book, The War Against the Jews. And this shows us the aftermath of what happens in this small town. After 3 months of terror, arrests, shootings, expropriations, impressments into forced labor, the Jews were expelled on December 17th, 1939. In the depths of the Polish winter, they were marched out on the highway, men, women, children, and infants, the hail and the halt, with the few belongings they were permitted to take in sacks, baby carriages, wheelbarrows, push carts, bicycles, and sleds. The nearest town was Glouno, on the border of the newly incorporated area and the general government, which most managed to reach. Well, most does not mean all, so of course that means that some died on the way. Another aspect of life in the ghettos was the idea of encouraging Jew hate amongst Poles. Now, anti-Semitism was already rife in Poland before the German invasion. It was not some Shangri-La for Polish Jews where everyone lived in harmony. They were targeted with anti-Semitism. However, Polish Jews and Polish Christians shared in suffering and terror during the German Blitzkrieg in September because their country was being invaded and, to an extent, destroyed by the Nazi war machine. Yet after the Germans conquered Western Poland, they went about encouraging hatred against Polish Jews. And by encouraging, I mean encouraging Polish Christians to hate Polish Jews. So having conquered Warsaw, the Germans, and this is an example, having conquered Warsaw, the Germans agreed to distribute soup to the city's inhabitants regardless of their religion. Yet when the soup lines were established, the Germans immediately set about expelling Jews from the queues. Poles were encouraged to join in, which many of them did. So what we have here is an interesting photograph. You've got only a couple of Nazis in this photograph, and the rest are Poles. And many of them are posing for the camera. There's a chap on the right who's smiling. There's a couple people smiling in the photo. And what we have here are Germans and Poles humiliating a Jew in Tomaszow Mazowiecki. And it looks like they're trimming off his beard, which again is a humiliating act. And of course, another aspect of ghettoization is, or was, economic destruction. Because the Nazis immediately confiscated Jewish-owned shops in Poland and businesses in the autumn of 1939. Retail stores were shuttered so Wehrmacht and SS bigwigs could plunder them. So what the Nazis would do first is just close down the shops and then ransack them themselves. And I suppose anything that was left might get shipped back to Germany. And here's another quotation from Davidovitz. Sometimes Jewish shops were ordered to be opened only so that they could be plundered and robbed. In large manufacturing centers, military trucks carried off the goods of Jewish factories and stores. Now, what happens to the livelihood of these Jews? Well, of course, it doesn't matter when it comes to the Germans because these Jews are going to be essentially imprisoned in the ghettos anyway. And another aspect of ghettoization was identification, because it was in Poland, and specifically the general government, where Jews were first forced to wear the Star of David around their arm. So, of course, this has become, in a sense, an infamous perversion of a Jewish symbol, because this was forced upon them to identify them. On the 23rd of November 1939, Hans Frank, who we will recall ran the general government, decreed that all Jews in the general government over the age of 10 were to wear a white badge with a blue Star of David on their right arm. And of course, what's the reason for this? It made it easier to identify Jews in order to harass them, to round them up, to torment them, and of course eventually murder them as well. Jews who ignored this law risked death. Now it's worth looking at conditions in the ghetto. We've kind of looked at the lead up to ghettoization in some respects. Well, what was going on inside the ghettos once they are set up? Well, one is overcrowding, as you could expect. Ghettos were often located in the poorest parts of Polish towns and cities. That's not surprising. They're going to be forced into the areas where most people don't want to be. Buildings and tenements were often dilapidated, that's to say, falling down, or damaged from the German invasion. And in the towns anyway, sometimes the streets were made of dirt if the ghettos were on the outskirts of towns. And you might say here, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, just imagine when it starts raining and you've got an overcrowded population trudging through the mud day in and day out. That is not going to promote a good deal of hygiene. And we'll talk about hygiene in a moment. Now, one of the worst aspects, as I said, however, was overcrowding. And this gives us a good idea about overcrowding in Vilna, and this would be similar in other ghettos. In Vilna, and this is a quotation from a Jewish doctor who is living in the Vilna ghetto, about 25,000 persons live in our ghetto, in 72 buildings on 5 street sections. Comes to 1.5 to 2 meters per person, narrow as a grave. So you've got far too many people in far too small a space. And of course, what that's going to mean is you're going to have serious hygiene problems. You've got people forced into the worst parts of towns and cities, too many people, not enough space. It's going to be a nightmare when it comes to trying to keep people clean, trying to keep people from not passing on disease, etc. So given the overcrowding, the lack of water, the lack of soap, etc., it's no wonder that hygiene was a huge problem in the ghettos. Think about it this way. You have some clean drinking water, but you don't have a lot. It's not unlimited. What are you going to use that water for? Are you going to use it to cook your meals, or are you going to use it to clean yourself and your family? Well, the answer is you're going to use it to cook food. So there's not a lot of water, there's not enough water to keep clean. And we must remember that in these buildings, you've got multiple families being squeezed into an area that is only fit perhaps for one family. They have to use communal kitchens, communal toilets. How long could those areas be kept clean? And the answer is not very long. If you think about people defecating in one toilet, and you've got dozens of people perhaps, that's not going to stay clean, no matter how hard you try. And remember, there's not enough running water for people to keep things like that clean anyway. And again, thinking about it this way, how could toilets in the poorest parts of town and cities keep up with the amount of excrement, that's to say pee and poo, due to the overcrowding? And indeed, if the sanitation, let's say the pipes running from these buildings are in really poor condition because they're in the poorest parts of town, or indeed if there are no pipes for human feces, that means that a lot of this is done in buckets and then thrown somewhere in the town. And another aspect, of course, of conditions in the ghetto is the fact that Poland is quite a cold place in winter. Poland experiences, at least northern Poland certainly, experiences very cold winters. And coal was so dear, it was called black pearls. So the idea that to have something to burn to keep warm was a constant problem. And many people died from lack of fuel in the winter. And you can imagine what people in particular, the old and the very young. And this is a quotation from Emanuel Ringelblum, and he described this in his diary. The first frosts have already appeared, and the populace is trembling at the prospect of cold weather. The most fearful sight is that of freezing children. Little children with bare feet, bare knees, and torn clothing stand dumbly in the street weeping. Tonight, the 14th of November, I heard a tot of 3 or 4 yammering. The child will probably be found frozen to death tomorrow morning, a few hours off. Early October, when the first snows fell, some 70 children were found frozen to death on the steps of ruined houses. Frozen children are becoming a general phenomenon. And these conditions only worsened in September 1941 when the Germans confiscated all furs for the Wehrmacht soldiers fighting in Russia. So that quotation, of course, is from 1939, but you can imagine suffering through multiple winters And the final winter of ghettoization, winter jackets are taken away, winter clothing. And of course, one of the worst things, we've seen several horrible things: overcrowding, the cold, and of course, hunger, not having enough to eat. Now, yes, remember that the productionists won out. They did turn ghetto Jews into slave laborers for the war effort. However, there was never enough food for all the Jews in the ghetto. And here I use ghetto, I suppose metaphorically in a sense, for all the ghettos, not just one, of course. By November 1941, deliberate Nazi policy was to provide Jews with half the rations that Poles received. And this came out to about 1,100 calories per day. An adult man today requires around 2,500 calories, an adult woman around 2,000 calories. But that's not taking into account if one is expected to do back-breaking physical labor for 8 to 10 hours a day. Then you're looking at, you would need something like 3,000 calories or 3,500 calories a day. So long story short, the Jews need a lot more than 1,100 calories per day. Now, what did they eat typically? Well, the staples were potatoes and coarse bread. That's not surprising because both those things are quite cheap. Occasionally, Jews would get horse meat or maybe some fish would be available. And here's a quote from Yehuda Elberg, another victim of the Nazis living in one of the ghettos. A debuk, which is to say a demon, had entered my belly. My belly talks, shouts, even has complaints, and drives me mad. Well, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and there's some, I dare say, harrowing photographs coming up. This one not so much, but that gives us an idea. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a soup line, women and children queuing up to get some soup. These are starving children in the Warsaw Ghetto. Similarly, starving children in the Warsaw Ghetto, and the girl in the foreground could be dead there. And finally, children begging for food in the Warsaw Ghetto. Here's a good quotation from Davidovitz, because often, of course, we all get hungry a little bit, but I'm guessing that probably none of us have faced starvation. And I think it is hard to get your head around just how much it affects you, not just physically, but also mentally. So let's look at this quotation. Hunger killed, but first it wrought disabling change, mental, psychological, and physical. Loss of weight and the disappearance of subcutaneous fat aged and withered victims. Hunger destroyed the normal rhythm of existence, affected the physical capacity to work, and the mental ability to think. Nutrition deficiencies caused anemia, suppressed the menses, that's to say the menstrual flow for women. Fatigue and dizziness, apathy and depression were part of the general sense of malaise. Nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea were the daily complaints of hunger. Now, this is something I haven't mentioned, that within the ghettos themselves, the Nazis themselves didn't want to be inside the ghettos administering them. One, because the conditions were so horrible. So what they had was something called a Judenrat. And what this was essentially a Jewish council that would administer the ghetto for the Nazis. So Jews were compelled, and the orders came from Reinhard Heydrich, remember that was Himmler's right-hand man, to form councils in every ghetto. So this is an SS order. Judenrat members were often already leaders of their communities. That makes complete sense. For example, rabbis or educated members of the middle class. So if you already have leaders who are in the ghetto, it makes sense that they'll become Judenrat members. And again, very simply, their task was to maintain order within the ghettos. And in reality, what this meant, that meant that they were functionaries who carried out German orders. So the Germans gave orders, the Judenrat members would carry it out. Now, they did have some important responsibilities. One was to compile accurate lists of Jewish inhabitants and their property. I think you could probably think through why that would be the case. Well, the property, of course, so the Germans can confiscate it and steal it. And getting accurate lists of Jewish inhabitants, again, the government wants to know who these people are, what their names are, etc., for the time when the ghettos are liquidated. And of course, the Judenrat would also recruit forced laborers. So when you had labor gangs going out of the ghettos to go do work somewhere, it would be the Judenrat who would organize those labor battalions. Now, what we're going to finish off the lesson with is the notion of spiritual survival. And I have here just a little bit of a song from the Vilna Ghetto. Moshe, hold on. Keep hold of yourself. Remember, we must get out. Moshe, hold on. Hold on, Moshe. It isn't very long. The hour soon will toll. So this was a popular song. And it really is the idea of don't give up. If there's a message there, don't give up. And as I think I've alluded to several times now, living in such horrific conditions is self-evidently destructive to the human soul. There's only so much that the human soul can take before it's broken. And no doubt many Jews in the ghetto were broken, but many also held on to their humanity, they held on to hope, etc. And how a lot of them did that was that they took solace in religious traditions, even if they were not themselves religious. And one of the traditions is the idea of keeping hope alive. And I've got some quotations here. A Jew lives with hope. While there's life, there's hope. And finally, even when the slaughtering knife is at your throat, don't lose hope. And again, according to Davidovitz, the religious teachings and folk wisdom permeating every ghetto in Eastern Europe supplied the antidote to depression and despair. And I think without these things, more Jews would have succumbed to suicide or just giving up, etc. Now, the family as a component of spiritual survival shouldn't be really surprising, just given human nature. But given their nature of strong familial bonds in particular, Jewish families often pulled together to weather the hardships and brutality of the ghettos. And unsurprisingly again, family relationships often deepened. And moreover, familial bonds extended beyond the nuclear family. So not just mom, dad, and children, but grandparents, aunts and uncles, etc. Extended families that had lost touch often reunited in the ghetto. It was preferable to share crowded lodgings with family than with strangers, because at least you know who your family is. Now, of course, the ghettos, this did not become a utopia. This was not some kind of family paradise on earth. Family members did steal food from each other. Family quarrels did happen, of course. Yet this seems that this was the exception rather than the rule. And surviving statistical evidence proves that bonds strengthened. Divorces virtually ceased in the ghettos, marriages boomed, and widows and widowers remarried at higher rates than before 1939. And I'll finish up here with a quote from Davidovitz. At bottom, Jews shared a deep faith in their ultimate survival and in the preservation of the Jewish people. Early in the war, Chaim Kaplan observed, "Our existence as a people will not be destroyed. Individuals will be destroyed, but the Jewish community will live on." Conclusions. The ghettos were brutal, grotesque, and horrifying. In the process, thousands of communities were destroyed permanently. As I said, only 10,000 Jews live in Poland today. From the very start of their occupation, Germans encouraged Poles to humiliate and hate Jews. It was in the ghettos where Jews had to first wear the Star of David. Living conditions were awful, overcrowding, hygiene, cold, hunger. The Judenrat were responsible for the internal administration of the ghettos and maintaining order for their Nazi masters. And finally, Jews, mainly with great success, maintained their sanity and kept their spirits alive through faith and family. So next lesson, we'll be moving away from the ghettos. We'll be, in a sense, returning to Germany and looking at the euthanasia program.